In 2010, a psychologist by the name of Brené Brown gave a TED Talk entitled The Power of Vulnerability. That talk catapulted her from relative obscurity to nationwide popularity. With over 50 million views, it would become one of the most popular TED Talks ever delivered. And that's because what Brené Brown spoke about is a subject that nearly everyone can relate to, something everyone has experienced, which is shame. That's what Brené Brown's TED Talk was about, shame. And shame isn't the same as guilt. That's one of the points that she makes. Shame, she says, is a focus on self. Guilt is a focus on behavior. Guilt is, I did something bad. Shame is, I am bad. Guilt says, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Shame says, I'm sorry, I am a mistake. Shame isn't just about what you've done. It's about who you are. Today, people often say that Western cultures like the United States and Western Europe, that we tend to focus on guilt and innocence, whereas many Eastern cultures are more dominated by an emphasis on honor and shame. But if there's any conclusion that we can draw from the enormous popularity of Brené Brown's talk, it is surely that her Western audience is still intimately familiar with shame. We know what it feels like, not just to feel bad about what we've done, but bad about who we are. That's not just an Eastern cultural phenomenon. It's a universal human experience. And you can see it in the Bible too. The language of honor and shame is all over the place in the Bible. And in the cultures in which the Bible was written, there were very much cultures of honor and shame. Honor and shame, they also play a big role in the book of Ruth, one that we may sometimes miss, but it's very present and very important. I think that this is especially true in chapter 3. In this strange account of what happens when Ruth goes to visit Boaz on the threshing floor. So in this video, as we walk through this chapter, we're going to pay special attention to this dynamic of shame and honor. And through this story, we're going to better understand the role that shame and honor play in our lives as Christians as well. First, let's walk through the story, dividing it up into 3 scenes, beginning with scene 1, Naomi's advice. As chapter 3 begins, we hear the voice of Naomi saying to Ruth, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you that it may be well with you?" This is the first time since leaving Moab that Naomi has said something that shows real concern for Ruth's well-being. Of course, at the end of chapter 2, she also says that it's good to work in Boaz's field, since if Ruth goes to another field, she may be assaulted. But prior to this statement in chapter 3, this relationship between Ruth and her mother-in-law has sometimes seemed a little one-sided. And perhaps there's a lesson in that for us. In her grief, Naomi was despondent, so despondent that she really couldn't see sometimes beyond her own pain. But now, because of Ruth's kindness and God's provision, now it seems Naomi seems to be coming out of that grief and turning her attention away from herself and toward her daughter-in-law. And she's concerned about Ruth because Ruth still has no husband. Back in chapter 1, verse 9, Naomi had blessed both Ruth and Orpah by praying that they would find rest. That's the word she used, rest in the homes of husbands. But Ruth, Naomi says, still has no rest. No protection, no provision. So Naomi gives her some advice. She tells her to wash up, put on some clean clothes and some perfume, and go watch Boaz until he's eaten and he lies down for the night. And then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. To us, this may just sound like really bizarre dating advice. As if Naomi's saying, look, it's been months, Boaz hasn't made a move, so why don't you just go lay awkwardly underneath his sheet while he's sleeping and see what happens? But remember, this is a very different culture. And such a plan would have made more sense at the time. Even still, what Naomi is asking Ruth or advising Ruth to do is very risky because it could easily be misconstrued, especially given the fact that Ruth is a Moabite. Remember, in the Bible, the people of Moab are remembered as a nation founded upon the sexual immorality of Lot's two daughters. And then, of course, there's the story of what took place in Numbers 25, when the Israelite men defiled themselves by having immoral sexual relations with Moabite women. So as you can imagine, Moabite women don't exactly have the best reputation. And now Naomi is telling Ruth to do something that could easily be misunderstood as some kind of illicit overture. Naomi is asking Ruth to put what little honor she has in Bethlehem on the line. It's a lot to ask. But Ruth once again shows trust, and she does what Naomi says. Which brings us to scene 2, the threshing floor. I've always found this to be a very strange scene. Ruth sneaking into the barley threshing floor while Boaz is asleep and then laying underneath the corner of his cloak by his feet until he wakes up. There's a lot we could say about this scene, but I want to focus on the role that shame and honor play. Notice first what Boaz says to Ruth when he wakes up and realizes she's there. "Who are you?" he says, which, let's be honest, is probably the first question that would leap to any of our minds if we woke up and found somebody sleeping at our feet. What in the world? Who are you? But I think there's something deeper to Boaz's question. Because even if he's just trying to figure out what's going on, the question that he asks gets right to the heart of Ruth's life at that moment. Who are you? Isn't that what everyone's asking of her? Who are you? Are you just some foreigner? Just some poor tag-along to poor Naomi? Are you just one more Moabite woman, just as godless and immoral as the rest of them? Who are you? That's the question underneath the experience of shame, according to Brené Brown. And that's the question hanging over Ruth. And when she responds, we get a clue as to just how deeply she may be feeling the weight of that question. "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." What is she asking from him? From how she's dressed and what she's doing, it's obvious to him what she wants. She's not just asking him to give her some of his cloak as a blanket. She's asking him to marry her. But why phrase it that way? Why ask him to spread his wings over her? Well, on the one hand, she's simply repeating back to him the same words he spoke to her in their first meeting, when he had blessed her and said, "A full reward be given you by the Lord, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." But maybe there's more to it than that. In Ezekiel chapter 16, the prophet describes a vision where he sees the nation of Israel portrayed as an unwanted baby, left in the wilderness, and then rescued by a passerby who's the Lord. And then, speaking in the voice of the Lord, he says, "When I passed by you again and saw you, behold, you were at the age for love, and I spread the corner of my garment over you and covered your nakedness. I made my vow to you and entered into a covenant with you, and you became mine." That verse suggests two things. First, that spreading the corner of your garment over a woman can be a symbol of committing to marry her. But also that by marrying her, by spreading your garment over her, you are covering her nakedness, which means protecting her from public shame. And that's what Ruth is asking Boaz to do, not just to marry her, not just to give her the protection and provision of his household, but also to protect her from shame by covering her with his honor. Remember, Boaz is one of the most revered, one of the most honored men in Bethlehem. And how does he respond? He responds not only by accepting her request, but also by heaping her with praise, with words of honor about who she is, and then protecting her honor even further by telling his men not to let anyone know that she had come there at night. And then he sends her home with an enormous bag of grain. Which brings us finally to scene 3, Ruth's return. When Ruth returns, Naomi asks her a rather odd question. It's a question that often befuddles translators. The English Standard Version renders Naomi's question as, "How did you fare, my daughter?" The NIV has something very similar. "How did it go, my daughter?" That's the NIV translation. And I have to say, both of these translations, they're very good translations. I like reading them both. But in this one instance, the King James Version is more accurate. Because as odd as it seems, the question that Naomi asks Ruth is actually the exact same question, the exact same words that Boaz poses to her in verse 9. To quote the King James, "And when Ruth came to her mother-in-law, she said, 'Who art thou, my daughter?'" Who art thou? Who are you? That's Naomi's question. But why would she ask her that? It's not as if she doesn't recognize her. She addresses her as my daughter. So why does she ask it? Has she perhaps noticed something different? Something changed in Ruth? Or, as one commentator observes, is she perhaps simply voicing the question that has been on her mind for some time? This question is a question Naomi struggles with throughout the book of Ruth. Who is this Moabitess? Is she perhaps of no significance, an outsider and outcast, as Naomi viewed her back in chapter 1? Or is she, in fact, rather more than Naomi had ever thought? As I mentioned in the introduction of this video, this is the question behind all of our experiences of honor and shame. This question of who are we? Are we outcasts, failures, people of no consequence? Or are we something more? And how can we become something more? Is it something we earn, something that will come as a result of personal achievement, or is it something conferred upon us? For Ruth, in many ways, this is the question that has been lurking behind this entire episode in chapter 3. Who is she? Just some foreigner, some no-good Moabitess, some poor widow, or something much more? By the end of the chapter, it seems that she is becoming something much more, someone who will be a woman of great honor in Bethlehem, the soon-to-be wife of the revered Boaz. But for now, as she returns to Naomi's house, for now, she is still waiting for all of that to be revealed. For now, as she hears Naomi's question of who are you, all she can do is trust in the goodness and the promises of Boaz. And in that sense, I think that Ruth, in this chapter, is a model of the Christian life. Because you and I, we also wrestle with this question of who are you? And at some point in time, we have to learn the lesson that Ruth learned. That we won't be able to deliver ourselves from our own shame. That the only way to escape it, the only way to be covered, not in shame, but in the honor that we desire, is by asking our Redeemer to cover us. And that is precisely what he does. The Bible tells us that when Christ came to redeem us, he did it by taking our shame upon himself. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Jesus bore our shame. He was despised. He was rejected. He was mocked and belittled and dishonored. And why? Why would he endure all that? He took our shame upon himself so that he, the New Testament tells us, could clothe us with his honor. To quote John Calvin, receiving our poverty unto himself, Christ has transferred his wealth to us. Taking the weight of our iniquity upon himself, he has clothed us with his righteousness. Or as another famous reformer once put it in his own commentary on Ruth chapter 3, now sin is covered by Christ when he dwells in us. As Ruth said to Boaz, spread your coat over your handmaiden, for you are a redeemer. And she took the coat and laid it at his feet. That is, the soul lies down at the humanity of Christ and is covered by his righteousness. Like Ruth, we live under the weight of shame. Like her, we wrestle with this question, who are you? And like her, we have been covered by our Redeemer. And we have been promised by him that he will take away our shame and clothe us with honor. But also for now, like Ruth, we must learn to wait, just as she did in Naomi's house, and trust his promise. Because even still, we have people asking us the question that Naomi asked Ruth, who are you? And even still, even for those of us who are Christians, this is a question that we continue to ask ourselves. And so there's something we can learn from Ruth, because just as Ruth waited in Naomi's house, trusting in the promise of Boaz, so now we wait, waiting to be honored, longing, as the Apostle Paul says, for the weight of glory that will one day clothe us. And as we wait, we trust, just like Ruth did, in the promise and the goodness of our Redeemer.